Donald Trump looked directly at the royal guard and said it. "Get him out of the shot." Then, when the guard didn't move fast enough for his liking, I said, "Remove the royal guard." He thought he was being presidential. What he didn't realize was who he was talking to. A Coldstream Guardsman who once carried his dying squadmate 4 kilometers through Taliban territory and never abandoned his post. But this time, he did something different. He broke protocol, asked for 60 seconds, and what he said in those 60 seconds made even Trump stop talking. Want to see exactly how it unfolded? First, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. You know that particular kind of gray English morning where the mist hangs so low it feels like you're breathing clouds? That's exactly what it was like at Windsor Castle as the November drizzle finally stopped, leaving the ancient stones dark with moisture. Inside St. George's Hall, British aides whispered urgently into earpieces, while American press photographers jostled for position, their camera flashes firing against the oak-paneled walls. The marble floors echoed with designer heels and security boots, creating a strange percussion that made everyone speak too loudly. And at the far edge of this controlled chaos, standing motionless beside the entrance to the main reception area, was Corporal James Redley. If you saw him from a distance, you'd think he was some kind of living statue. Scarlet red tunic pressed razor-sharp black bearskin hat, white gloves so pristine they seemed to glow. But if you looked closer, you'd see the details that told a different story. The way he held his left shoulder slightly higher, compensating for something that never quite healed, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow, the calloused hands beneath those spotless gloves. Corporal James Redley wasn't just another face under a bearskin hat. At 31, he'd already lived 3 lives. First, a cramped Birmingham council flat where his dad drove buses for 18 years without missing a day. "Reliability," his father used to say, "is the only thing they can't take away from you, son." His second life began at 18 in the army, where he learned that silence could be its own kind of strength. His third life started in Afghanistan, Helmand province, during his second tour when everything went sideways. The roadside bomb flipped their vehicle into a ditch, killing the driver and pinning their Afghan interpreter under twisted metal. That's when Redley learned what real silence meant. For 6 hours he lay in that wreckage with broken ribs and blood in his eyes, keeping 22-year-old Rashid conscious by getting him to talk about his baby daughter. 6 hours of sniper fire, waiting for rescue helicopters, holding pressure on wounds with shaking hands. When the medics arrived, Redley refused morphine until Rashid was loaded onto the chopper first. The kid lived. Sent Redley a photo of his daughter's first steps. The commendation praised his exceptional composure under extreme duress, but the citation sat unopened under his bed, because he'd learned something in that ditch that no ceremony could capture, that real strength wasn't about being unbreakable, it was about breaking and still holding the line. Because rolling through the castle gates came a motorcade that had everyone's attention, 3 black Range Rovers followed by press fans, and a Mercedes full of nervous aides. This wasn't a scheduled state visit. This was damage control disguised as diplomacy. Trump's polls had been tanking since his latest scandal involving classified documents and NATO comments. So here he was, trying to wrap himself in royal prestige. Trump emerged from the lead vehicle like a man who owned the place, adjusting his expensive navy overcoat and flashing that practiced camera smile. His entourage trailed behind, aides clutching briefing folders, Secret Service scanning corners, his press secretary already talking about optics. As his group moved through the reception hall, Trump's eyes swept the room like a director surveying a movie set. He shook the right hands, said the right words, but you could see his attention wandering. That's when his gaze landed on Redley. Trump squinted, tilting his head like he was solving a puzzle. He leaned toward a security officer and said loud enough for several people to hear, "What's this guy doing here?" "He's the Coldstream Guard assigned to this section, sir. Standard ceremonial protocol," came the reply. Trump scoffed. He looks like a mannequin. Who's he supposed to be impressing? A few people chuckled nervously. A British aide winced but said nothing. Near the press section, a BBC reporter was explaining to her cameraman, "Standard political theater. He'll make remarks about special relationships and be out in 20 minutes. She had no idea she was about to witness something career-defining. Trump's group moved closer to the speaking area, but his attention kept drifting back to Redley. Something about the guard's perfect stillness seemed to irritate him, like a challenge he couldn't ignore. The cameras were rolling when Trump gestured toward Redley and said loud enough for every microphone to catch, "Get him out of the shot." The words hit the reception hall like a stone thrown into still water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Camera flashes paused. Even the British officials who'd been maintaining their diplomatic smiles looked stunned. A ripple of discomfort moved through the small crowd. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. One of Trump's aides, a young woman who'd probably spent weeks planning every detail of this visit, stepped closer to him with panic written across her face. "Sir, he's part of the ceremonial protocol. We can't just—" But Trump waved her off without even looking at her. His eyes were still fixed on Redley, who hadn't moved so much as a muscle. That's when Trump raised his voice, projecting it across the hall for everyone to hear. I said, "Remove the royal guard." The silence that followed wasn't polite ceremony. It was the heavy silence of a line being crossed. A man with a poppy pin turned to his wife. Did he just order them to remove a royal guard? A schoolboy tugged his teacher's sleeve. "Miss, why is that man being mean to the soldier?" The teacher found herself at a loss. Some people don't understand respect. A Marine veteran felt his jaw clench. He'd served alongside British forces, had seen what these men were capable of when the ceremonial uniforms came off. Watching a former president treat one like furniture made his stomach turn. The American security officer closest to Trump stepped forward hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the order, but unwilling to disobey in front of the cameras. He moved toward Redley with the reluctant steps of a man who really didn't want to be doing what he was doing. And that's when everything changed. Because Corporal James Redley, who had stood motionless through mortar attacks and protesters and drunk tourists trying to make him laugh, moved just one step, his left foot shifting slightly out of the perfect ceremonial position he'd maintained for the past 2 hours. The room froze. Guards didn't do that. Not in ceremony, not in the presence of media, and absolutely not in front of foreign dignitaries. Trump turned fully to face him, eyebrows raised in surprise. Redley's voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who'd learned that real power doesn't announce itself. "Just 60 seconds, sir," he said. "Then I'll return to post." For one long moment, nobody breathed. A royal guard had spoken in full dress uniform inside Windsor Castle, in front of a former US president and a room full of cameras. It was unprecedented. It was shocking. It was about to get worse. Trump's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement, but with an edge. He gestured to the crowd like he was performing at a rally. "Well, well," he said. The tin soldiers got words. A few supporters managed uncomfortable chuckles, but the laughter died quickly. Behind the press barrier, the BBC reporter, who'd been expecting standard political theater, suddenly found herself fumbling for her notepad, realizing she might be witnessing history. Redley stood perfectly still, but something had changed in his bearing. His eyes, which had been fixed on that distant point guards are trained to focus on, now met Trump's gaze directly. And in those eyes, you could see something that made the former president's smirk falter just slightly. This wasn't a man who could be intimidated. This was someone who'd stared down death in places Trump had never dreamed of, who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing what needed to be done despite the fear. Trump, sensing the shift but unwilling to back down, leaned into the moment with the bravado that had carried him through 1,000 confrontations. "All right, soldier," he said, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of mock magnanimity. "Enlighten us. You've got your minute." It was meant to be condescending, a way of maintaining control while pretending to be generous. But Trump had just made a crucial miscalculation. He'd given Redley permission to speak, and James Redley had been holding his silence for a very long time. Redley stepped forward, not toward Trump, but toward the center of the room, claiming the space with quiet confidence. 3 measured paces that took him far enough from his ceremonial post to make it clear this was a choice, not a reaction. He slowly removed one humor that had always worked for him before. Good voice on him could have been a podcast host. The joke fell flat. Worse than flat, it revealed just how completely he'd misunderstood what had just happened. Because this hadn't been performance or theater or political grandstanding. It had been truth spoken by someone who'd earned the right to speak it. And everyone in that room knew the difference. Trump's eyes flicked toward the cluster of press photographers, looking for the friendly faces that usually greeted him at events like this. But their expressions had changed. They weren't looking at him like a celebrity anymore. They were looking at him like a man who just revealed more about himself than he'd intended. A flash of irritation crossed his face, quickly replaced by the practiced smile of a politician, trying to regain control of a situation that had spun completely out of his hands. He leaned into the podium microphone with the air of a man trying to reclaim his footing. "Anyway," he said, his voice carrying a false brightness that fooled nobody. "Lovely to be here. Great castle, wonderful history." A pause during which you could practically hear him calculating his next move. "Some strong feelings today. That's fine. We're a country that respects strong voices when they follow the rules." It was meant to be a subtle dig, a way of suggesting that Redley had somehow been out of line, but it backfired spectacularly, because everyone present had just witnessed who in that room actually understood what service meant. Trump backed away from the microphone with the quick, tight movements of a man who'd realized he was losing a battle he'd never meant to start. But the damage was done. The moment belonged to Redley now, and no amount of spin or deflection could change that. What happened next would have been unthinkable just minutes earlier. The American delegation, Trump's own people, began to break ranks. It started with the Marine veteran who stepped forward and addressed Redley directly. "Semp," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Not to Trump, not to the cameras, but to the man in the red coat who just reminded them all what courage looked like. Then Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, who'd been part of the official U.S. military liaison, moved to stand closer to Redley's position. She didn't speak, but her presence was a statement in itself. One by one, others followed, not making a show of it, not trying to score political points, but simply acknowledging that they'd witnessed something that demanded recognition. Trump watched this happening with growing alarm. His own delegation was abandoning him for a foreign soldier who'd just broken protocol to call him out. His chief of staff appeared at his elbow, whispering urgently about exits and damage control and getting ahead of the story. But it was too late for management. The moment had already crystallized into something that couldn't be spun or explained away. "Let's wrap this up," Trump said tersely to his press secretary. "This thing's gone off message." But even as his team scrambled to orchestrate a graceful exit, the cameras kept rolling, the phones kept recording, and the story kept writing itself, because the image that would dominate headlines for weeks to come wasn't of Trump making diplomatic remarks or strengthening international relationships. It was of a royal guard who'd stood his ground against a man who thought he could move mountains with tweets and tantrums. Trump left the platform without ceremony, his entourage trailing behind him like the remnants of a retreating army. He avoided eye contact with the press, ignored the shouted questions, and made his way toward the exit with the stiff gait of a man who'd just suffered a very public defeat. But as he reached the doorway, he couldn't resist one last look back. Redley was still there, still standing at perfect attention, still representing something that couldn't be bought, bullied, or moved by force of personality. And for maybe the first time in his life, Donald Trump found himself looking at someone who simply wouldn't bend. Outside, the November drizzle had started again. Inside, Corporal James Redley had returned to perfect stillness, white gloves, spotless, rifle at the correct angle, eyes fixed forward. But the people around him had changed. A small cluster drifted closer to his position, standing in respectful silence. A boy from a school group approached the barrier and lifted his hand in an awkward salute. His teacher started to pull him back, then stopped. Some moments deserved to happen. Redley's eyes, just for a fraction of a second, shifted down to meet the boy's gaze. Then they returned forward, but not before the hint of a smile touched his mouth. The boy beamed and stepped back to his class, whispering to his friend, "Did you see? He saw me. The brave soldier saw me." Nearby, the Marine veteran who'd supported Redley during his speech was explaining something to his teenage daughter. "That man didn't break protocol, sweetheart. He upheld it. There's a difference between following rules and following orders, and sometimes you have to choose." She nodded slowly, still processing. "But wasn't he supposed to stay quiet?" "He was supposed to serve with honor," her father replied. "And sometimes that means speaking up when everyone else stays silent." From across the hall, another guardsman, a younger one, maybe 25, made his way over to Redley's position. He didn't speak immediately, just took up a position nearby, close enough to show solidarity, but far enough to maintain proper spacing. After a few minutes of shared silence, he said quietly, without turning his head, "They'll remember that, even if he won't." Redley didn't answer. His job wasn't to analyze the moment or discuss its implications. His job was to stand watch, to represent something larger than himself, to be present when presence mattered. But the younger guard's words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of truth that didn't need acknowledgement to be real. Meanwhile, in the corridors beyond the reception hall, Trump's team was in full damage control mode. His press secretary was on 3 different phones simultaneously, trying to craft a narrative that didn't make her boss look like he'd been schooled by a ceremonial guard. "We'll call it a closed event," she told one of the handlers. "Private diplomatic discussion. No footage for general release." But it was far too late for that strategy. The images were already spreading across social media like wildfire. Not just the official press photos, but dozens of phone recordings from guests who'd captured the moment when a guard stepped out of silence to speak truth to power. The headlines were writing themselves. Royal Guard schools, former president, when duty speaks to power, the soldier who wouldn't be moved. By evening, Redley's 60 seconds of broken protocol had become the most watched political moment of the month. By morning, it would be international news. But none of that mattered to the man standing motionless in Windsor Castle, because James Redley hadn't spoken up for fame or recognition or political advantage. He'd spoken because someone needed to remind the room that some things' honor, service, the memory of the fallen, couldn't be dismissed with a casual wave of the hand. He'd spoken because 60 seconds of truth was worth more than a lifetime of convenient silence. And now, having said what needed to be said, he'd returned to the duty that had always defined him, standing watch, holding the line, representing something that endured long after politicians and their speeches faded into footnotes. As the reception wound down and guests began to drift away, many of them paused near Redley's position, not to gawk or photograph, but to pay their respects to a man who'd reminded them what courage looked like when it wore a uniform. Some nodded, some saluted, some just stood quietly for a moment before moving on. All of them knew they'd witnessed something they'd never forget, the day when a royal guard broke protocol, not to rebel, but to uphold the very values that protocol was meant to protect. The day when silence became speech, and speech became a reminder that some principles are worth defending, no matter who's watching. The day when the quietest man in the room became the one everyone remembered. What happens when the person everyone expects to stay silent becomes the one who speaks the most truth? When breaking protocol becomes the most honorable thing you can do? When a guard who's trained never to react gives a reaction that changes everything? Corporal James Redley didn't plan to become famous that day. He didn't set out to create a viral moment, score political points, or embarrass anyone. He just asked for 60 seconds to speak his piece. And in those 60 seconds, he said more about service, sacrifice, and standing up for what's right than most politicians manage in entire careers. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't staying quiet. Sometimes it's knowing exactly when to speak. And sometimes, when you've earned the right to break the rules, breaking them becomes the most principled thing you can do. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone command a room not with volume, but with truth? When is breaking protocol more important than following orders? And what would you have done if you were standing in Corporal Redley's boots? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and conversations like these matter more than you might think. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most weight, hit that like button. It helps more people see moments like this. Make sure you're subscribed and ring that notification bell so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. These moments of quiet courage happen more often than you'd think, and we're here to share every one of them. And if you know someone who still thinks these guards are just for show, someone who could use a reminder about what real strength looks like, share this video with them. Your next story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real authority doesn't demand silence, it earns the right to speak. And when it does, the whole world stops to listen.